Live from the BDN Studios, it's Bang and Dang.
That's awesome.
If you don't like that, then
You ain't black.
Honey Springs, July 17th, in the Union's efforts to gain control of the Indian Territory. That's what we're trying to see right here. It was the largest confrontation between Union and Confederate forces in the area that would eventually become Oklahoma. The engagement was also unique in the fact that white soldiers were the minority in both fighting forces. Native Americans made up a significant portion of each of the opposing armies, and the Union force contained African American units as well. So look at that. Very little white people, huh?
At the very start of the American Civil War, for cultural and economic reasons, all the 5 civilized tribes in the Indian Territory opted to side with the Confederates, raising native troops under the leadership of General Douglas H. Cooper. They drove out pro-Union Creek Indian forces after a short campaign culminating in the Battle of Chustanala.
We had that a while ago.
However, by 1863, Confederate fortunes in the region had sunk. Union campaign launched from Kansas, led by Major General James Blunt.
You're beautiful.
Drove Confederacy forces from the north of the region, and many of the Cherokee switched sides to support the Union.
Wow, of course it did. Union forces led by Colonel William A. Phillips reoccupied Fort Gibson in Indian Territory during April, threatening Confederate forces at Fort Smith. However, Phillips' supply line stretched from Fort Gibson to Fort Scott, Kansas, 175 miles to the north along the Old Texas Road Cattle Trail. Confederate cavalry operating from Cooper's encampment at Honey Springs frequently harassed Fort Gibson and attacked its supply trains. Right.
Well, you got to do something. Battle of Honey Springs was very important for many reasons. Among them, the battle was the largest fought in the Indian Territory based on numbers of troops engaged.
Okay.
White soldiers were the minority in both Union and Confederate, which we said. Native Americans made up a significant portion of each. The loss of supplies at Honey Springs Depot would likewise prove disastrous. Confederate forces already operating on a shoestring budget and with bad equipment would come to increasingly rely on captured Union war material to keep on the fight. Honey Springs was an important site along with the Texas Road, a north-south artery between North Texas and Baxter Springs, Kansas, or Joplin, Missouri. The side that controlled this place could control traffic along this very road. Honey Springs was a direct threat to Fort Gibson, which controlled shipping on the upper Arkansas River.
Okay, so we got a lot at stake here, it seems like, huh?
It took them long enough to get there.
Right. Honey Springs was a stage stop on the Texas Road before the Civil War. Its several springs provided water for men and horses. The U.S. Army equipped it with a commissary, log hospital, and numerous tents for troops. To prepare for an invasion in 1863, the Confederate Army sent 6,000 soldiers to the spot. Provisions were supplied from Fort Smith, Boggy Depot, Fort Cobb, Fort Arbuckle, and Fort Washita. However, the Confederates failed to stop a 200-wagon Federal supply train in an engagement known as the Battle of Cabin Creek, which we covered. Yep. The supply train reached Fort Gibson about the same time as General Blunt himself arrived, accompanied by more troops and artillery.
Well, that's got to make a general happy.
Right.
Federal forces at the fort totaled about 3,000 men. According to his after-action report to General Schofield, Blunt arrived in the area on 11th of July, 1863. He found that Arkansas River was high and ordered his troops to begin building boats to ferry them across. During this very time, he apparently contracted encephalitis because he had spent July 14th in bed fighting a fever.
Oh.
Believing they were numerically superior, the Confederates plotted a counteroffensive against the Union forces at Fort Gibson, to be launched by Cooper's Indians and some attached Texan troops as well, and about 3,000 soldiers of the Brigadier General William Cabell's brigade. They were camped in Fort Smith, Arkansas, which were expected to reach Honey Spring by the 17th of July.
And they probably did, since that's when the battle started. Well, Cooper moved his army forward to Honey Springs, an important Confederate supply depot to rest and equip, while awaiting Cabell's brigade marching to link up with Cooper. Union forces under General Blunt got wind of Cooper's plan and opted to attack him first before Cabell arrived, which would have given the Confederates overwhelming numerical superiority.
Right.
Blunt's command included 3 Federal Indian Home Guard regiments recruited from all the 5 nations, and the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry, with 2 white cavalry battalions, the 6th Kansas and 3rd Wisconsin, 1 white infantry battalion consisting of 6 companies of the 2nd Colorado Infantry Regiment, and 2 Kansas artillery batteries making the remainder.
Look at that shit. All right. Blunt's troops crossed the Arkansas River in the late afternoon of the 16th of July. They began marching toward Honey Springs at about 11 p.m., continued throughout midnight. They encountered a Confederate picket near Chimney Rock, a local landmark. After routing that picket, they met a Confederate scouting party north of Elk Creek. They came upon the Confederate camp on Elk Creek early in the morning on the 17th of July. Confederate pickets saw the enemy guns in the early light and rushed to inform Cooper. After eating breakfast and resting from the march, Blunt formed his men into 2 brigades.
One of those brigades, led by William A. Phillips and composed of a battalion of the 6th Kansas Cavalry, the 1st and 3rd Regiments of Indian Home Guards, a battalion of the 2nd Colorado Infantry, and Captain Henry Hopkins' 4-gun battery of that Kansas Artillery, plus 2 guns of Captain Edward Smith's battery attached to the cavalry.
Okay.
The other one, commanded by Colonel William Judson, consisted of the 3rd Wisconsin Cavalry, the 2nd Regiment of the Indian Home Guards, and the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry, with an estimated 700 soldiers, plus they had the remainder of Smith's battery of his Kansas Artillery.
Right. Blunt's attack began on the 17th of July in the morning, and skirmishing that revealed many of the Confederate soldiers had wet gunpowder, causing numerous misfires and accidents. The main Union attack began at mid-afternoon, and the beginning of a rain squall intensified the Confederates' ammunition problems.
Yeah, you gotta keep that ammo dry, man.
Opposing
Or the powder.
Opposing artillerymen each eliminated 1 gun on the opposing side during an early artillery duel.
Look at that.
Then Blunt saw an opportunity. He ordered the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry to attack. Colonel James Williams led the Colored Volunteer Infantry forward, but the Confederates held their very ground. They're like, we're not going to let those Negroes run us away. Williams was wounded, but his troops conducted a disciplined withdrawal, and sporadic firing continued.
Well, afterwards, Blunt wrote, "Yo, beautiful." He said, "I never saw such fighting was done by the Negro Regiment. The question that Negroes will fight is settled. We've already settled this. Besides, they make better soldiers in every respect than any troops I have ever had under my command," he said. During this period, the 2nd Indian Home Guards, fighting for the Union, accidentally strayed into no man's land between the Confederate and Union lines. The Federal commander, he don't say nothing about the Indians.
Right.
The Federal commanders gave the order for the Home Guards to fall back, and the Confederates assumed it was an order to retreat and attacked. The Confederates charged into an established defensive line held by the 1st Kansas Colored Volunteer Infantry, which repulsed the charge.
Look at that.
Stupids.
All right. Cooper then pulled his men backwards towards the depot to obtain new ammunition, but Federals continued to press his arm closely. Heavy fighting occurred when Cooper's men made a stand at a bridge over Elk Creek, roughly a quarter mile south of the original position. Union forces continued driving them back, farther and farther, and gradually beginning to turn Cooper's left, causing a general Confederate retreat. Cooper attempted to fight a rear guard action, making a last stand another half-mile south near Honey Springs Depot. Despite a notable half-hour stand by the Choctaw and the Chickasaw Regiment, the Indians and the Texans were badly organized, disheartened, and in many cases, due to poor powder, unarmed. Wow. Most simply continued to flee. The fighting was over by 2 p.m., 4 hours after it had begun.
Jeez.
That's sad.
Victorious Union forces took possession of the Honey Springs Depot, burning what couldn't be immediately used and occupying the field. Blunt trumpeted the battle as a major victory, claiming Union losses of only 76, which were 17 dead, 60 wounded, with enemy casualties in excess of 500, although Cooper reported only 181 Confederate casualties, which was 134 killed or wounded and 47 taken prisoner. Cooper claimed that his enemy forces' losses were over 200.
Hey, that's possible.
Of course,
Right.
they're all going to say shit. Who knows?
Yeah, nobody. The Union Army, including its black and Native American forces, had a definite edge in both quantity and quality of weaponry. The Union artillery had 10 1857 12-pounder Napoleon howitzers, 2 6-pound howitzers, and plenty of Springfield rifles. The Union troops also had an abundance of shot, shells, and canisters. Confederates, well, poorly armed, typically with obsolete smoothbore muskets, flintlock
Oh,
shotguns.
jeez.
Ammunition for these was primarily made with cheap Mexican gunpowder that was very susceptible to damage by rainy weather, which we've already seen.
Right. The terrible equipment of the Confederates and the rain squall, which ruined their powder, played a large part in the defeat, although some eyewitness sources, notably future Creek Indian chief George Washington Grayson, claimed that Cooper's poor generalship was responsible for the defeat, arguing that about half the Confederate army was never even engaged.
Oh, wow.
So he's like, he didn't even send what he could. What an idiot.
After the battle, defeated Confederates withdrew, leaving their dead comrades behind. They met up with Cabal's 3,000 men relief force about 50 miles away. But General Blunt did not pursue them, as usual. because his own troops and horses were very tired.
We're very, very tired.
Very. He ordered them to camp overnight at the battlefield, where they could treat the wounded and bury the dead of both sides. Good for you guys. Blunt himself was still suffering a high fever from his bout of encephalitis. He finally had to spend the rest of the day in bed. Late that next day, Blunt ordered the troops to return to Fort Gibson. Later, Cooper wrote a letter to Blunt, thanking him for burying the Confederate dead. After the war, the Union corpses were exhumed and reburied in Fort Gibson National Cemetery.
He's like, hey, thanks for doing something because I was too much of a pussy to stick around.
Right.
The battle was the largest ever fought in Indian Territory, which you said, and would indeed prove to be decisive. Oklahoma Historical Society even compared its importance to the Battle of Gettysburg. I don't know about that. Maybe in the state of Oklahoma.
Right.
The victory opened the way for Blunt's forces to capture Fort Smith and the Arkansas River Valley all the way to the Mississippi.
Jeez.
The Confederates abandoned Fort Smith in August of 1863, leaving it for Union forces to recover. Of
course they did.
Well, there's a battle there that they didn't just run away from it.
Right.
Despite the efforts of notable Confederate officers like Stan Wadey, I've heard that name like before, Confederate forces in the region would never, ever again regain the initiative or engage the Union Army in an open head-on battle again.
Wow.
Instead, relying almost entirely on guerrilla warfare and small-scale cavalry actions to fight the Federal Army.
Okay.
The loss of the supplies at Honey Springs Depot would likewise prove disastrous, like it said it would. Confederate forces already operating on a shoestring budget and with bad equipment would come to increasingly rely on... We already didn't know.
Right.
Yeah, they're not getting anywhere without stealing from the Unions like a bunch of vultures.
Jeez.
Yeah, I mean, just give up. You're already cut off from your other army across the Mississippi anyways, dude. Just stop.
Right. Man, that was terrible.